Some people call me names. Ginger, Space Cowboy, Maurice not so much. I'm a joker. That's about as far as it goes with that song. Though I'm definitely a sinner. We don't need the Steve Miller Band to tell us that we are really viewed as at least slightly different things by different people. We might have an impression of ourselves, a bit like our Facebook image, presenting how we hope people might view us, and to us we might seem like we're worlds apart from everyone else or a certain particular person or people. But whatever hashtags we put to our names, or other people put on us, there are many things that we all share. As the stereotypical villain often says to the hero, we are not so very different, you and I. And sure enough, as far as the gospel goes, we are not so very different, you and I. Or any of us for that matter. And neither is the Apostle Paul. Let's listen to David Suchet read the audio Bible verses from Acts chapter 22 verse 30 to chapter 23 verse 11.
The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and set him before them. Chapter 23. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Those who were standing near Paul said, How dare you insult God's high priest? Paul replied, Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits. But the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.
Paul just seems to go from bad to worse, out of one near-death experience into another. While in Jerusalem it started off with an attack from a Jewish mob in chapter 21 verse 27. Then he gets a chance to speak to the crowd. He aggravates them further. As a result, he is sentenced to a session of interrogation under the Cat of Nine Tails, but thanks to his Roman citizenship he gets an opportunity of another audience, or several. First audience then, here, is before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, the same body who had condemned Jesus and Stephen. And as we just heard in the reading, it didn't look too optimistic for Paul here either. Before Paul even really gets to explain himself, the high priest orders for him to get a good smack in the mouth. Hardly too fair, especially at a trial, which is why Paul responds how he does. Verse 3, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit here to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. From the next couple of verses later, it seems that Paul didn't realise that he was talking to the high priest, in which case it's another facepalm moment for Paul. Ah no, it's just one stuff up after another. But at the same time, it's hard to believe Paul didn't know who he was talking to. Ananias had been high priest for over a decade. The previous run of high priests had lasted only a year or two at best. And even the way the Sanhedrin was laid out, with Ananias taking the prominent position, and from the fact that Ananias gave the order, surely Paul would know who he was. Hard to know. Paul's apology might be a little sarcastic or ironic even, sort of like saying, "Oh, forgive me. I didn't realize that the high priest and leader of Israel would give a command like that." Ananias certainly was a controversial figure. A few years previously, Ananias had been sent to Rome to stand trial for acts of violence, but Emperor Claudius let him off with it because he was a good friend of Rome. Violence, assassinations. You could call him Don Ananias, the Godfather. And whether Paul intentionally addressed him or not in his words here, it ended up being somewhat prophetic. When the Jewish revolt took place just a few years after this, in AD 66, Ananias was dragged out from his place of hiding and was struck down and murdered by Jewish nationalists. Even now, clearly not every member of the Sanhedrin was a fan of Ananias, especially among the Pharisees, who were a little bit like the opposition party in government. Politically and religiously, the Pharisees were quite different from the Sadducees, which is the party that Ananias belonged to. And the riot that follows is because Paul, identifying with the Pharisees and their belief in the resurrection, successfully plays off the two parties against each other and creates division in the Sanhedrin government. It might seem like a cute move by Paul, but it nearly cost him his life, again. In verse 10 we read that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces, so he sent in the troops to rescue him. Also, from the Lord's comforting words in verse 11, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." We can't really, from these two verses, get the impression that Paul was getting some kind of a kick out of being rebellious or stirring up trouble. As the Lord's words suggest, Paul was hoping that in each of these difficult and dangerous interactions to testify about Jesus and share something of the message of the gospel. We read from previous chapters in Acts that there were believers among the Pharisees. Paul's controversial statements were in effect reaching out in the hope that other Pharisees, already believing in the resurrection, might look to Jesus as the one all their prophecies and beliefs about the resurrection looked forward to. It might not seem like it at first, but the Apostle Paul, true to form, is using this as an opportunity to preach the message, in season, out of season, in the hope that some might come to believe in Jesus and be saved. And we can learn an important lesson about how Paul interacts here and preaches to the various aggressive groups during his time here in Jerusalem. Paul meets three reasonably different groups over the course of these couple of chapters. At the beginning of chapter 22, Paul addresses the angry mob who was wanting to tear him apart. He calls them brothers and fathers. He identifies as a fellow Roman citizen to the Roman tribune who was about to have him whipped to within an inch of his life. And now, in chapter 23, again calling them brothers, he identifies here as a Pharisee, having the same religious tradition as many of the men who would see him judged and executed, and who proudly belonged to the religious system that had Jesus condemned and executed. Paul isn't presenting the message like he has all the right answers, or that he is better, or somehow superior, condescending to them. His approach is to say, we're not so very different, you and I. Which sadly isn't always the model when it comes to sharing or preaching the good news of Jesus. It more often comes across like some kind of colonial, condescending superiority. Like, let me stoop down to your level to set you right. I'm in the right, you're in the wrong. Let me educate you. Acts chapter 17, where Paul is preaching in Athens, is often taken as a kind of a model text, or a textbook example, of how to share the gospel with people who are sceptical about God, or at least sceptical about the God of the Bible. But it's far from a proof text. The word apologetics, Christian apologetics that is normally connected with Paul's Acts 17 sermon in Athens. It's a well-constructed, cleverly put-together argument, like a kind of courtroom defence, and the idea of a great apologetic sermon is that it should persuade people to believe, similar to how someone might win a debate, or win the court and persuade the jury. That's the goal anyway. But the actual word apologetics Paul uses not so long ago when he actually gives his testimony, as we would call it, in Acts chapter 22 verse 1. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defence, my apologia. And he goes on not to give any kind of an intellectual argument, but to tell them his own personal story of how he became a believer through the grace and mercy of God. Rather than highlighting their differences, certainly not their inferiority, or pointing out where they are wrong, he actually highlights their commonality. Brothers and fathers. We're not so different, you and I. If the Apostle Paul was to get himself involved in a Christianity versus atheism debate, which I doubt he would, but if he did, he would certainly include his testimony, which sadly is something that can get left out of the more respectable and intellectual approaches to evangelism. The temptation for all of us, for all human beings, is to want to look smarter, or more respectable, or to be in the right. To be at the heart of that competitive spirit is that desire for superiority, to want to be better than our fellow human beings. All of us. But not only does an intellectual and argumentative approach contradict what Paul teaches, for example in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, it really contradicts the heart of the gospel itself. And sadly, very sadly, as the evangelical Christian community has been recently reminded, focusing on the intellect, the mind, doesn't do much to help steer the heart. If we can learn anything from the great wisdom of King Solomon, we should learn that it's not that smart to want to be smart. The gospel is a message to the heart. It's not about being elite or superior or intellectually enlightened. As a preacher called D.T. Niles once said, evangelism is just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. Christians are just normal, everyday people, nothing special, nothing different, just normal people who have been found by Jesus. If you're a Christian, or at least claim to be, then it's good to remember that you did not become a Christian because you were intellectually persuaded to do so. It's because you became aware of your need of Jesus, your Saviour and friend and King. And if you're a Christian, or at least claim to be, maybe you're quite moral as far as things go. Maybe you're respectable and respected. But you have so much in common with the most savage examples of human beings. Could you walk into a prison and call a man brother? What about a man who just tried to murder you? Because that's what Paul did. Sure, he's not your brother in Christ, but let's try and see past the hundreds of years of Christian violence and elitism and superiority and remember that in many respects, we're all brothers and fathers and mothers and daughters. It's a large part of what it is to see people as human, part of one human family. Or when it comes to citizenship and national identity, are there some people that you would flat out refuse to be identified with? No, I'm nothing like them. Different class of human being, that lot. Well, that's not how Paul saw it. Or when you look at other religious groups, from other religious backgrounds, with even the most extremely different views, including even the most dangerous extremists, can you see any human resemblance of yourself in them? Contrary to David Icke, Jim Corr and Alex Jones, some people are not giant lizards disguised in human skin. There are no subhuman lizards walking among us, or Nephilim aliens, or cockroaches, or rats. Just other human beings. Just other beggars like you and me that need to find the bread of life. Whether you're a believer or unbeliever, we are all essentially made of the same stuff. Yeah, sure, some people are bad eggs. But from the best to the worst of us, if you can make such a distinction, we're all just human beings that need to hear about Jesus. We're really not that different. The gospel is a message of change and forgiveness. That's not a message for the intellectuals, or the respectables, or for one particular nationality or religious group or family background. Christians are just sinners, like me, like you, like the Apostle Paul, that have found forgiveness in Jesus Christ. We're not so very different, you and I. In ourselves, we're both sinners, aren't we? And we're both dying, aren't we? Dying sinners. And so your hope, and my hope, has to be that same hope that Paul preached to these Pharisees. The hope of the resurrection of the dead through Jesus. I'm not telling you this because I'm any better than you, in any way. I'm telling you because I'm just like you.